I have never been Protestant, and growing up in the FSSP, I don't think I actually knew very many converts from Protestant Christianity to Catholic Christianity. But for whatever reason, Catholic YouTube seems to be comprised primarily of Protestant converts to Catholicism rather than cradle Catholics like me. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but that's just, how it seems to me. Regardless, comments like this one are quite easy to find on YouTube under any video about apostolic succession. In my opinion, apostolic succession is the most convincing argument in favor of Catholicism. When I was still Protestant, I thought if apostolic succession is true and I'm not a member of that church, that's scary. This comment in particular was found under this video. Does the Catholic Church have unbroken apostolic succession? Posted by Catholic Answers. In this video, Jimmy Akin makes some claims that I would like to push back on, but he also makes some claims that I kind of just want to highlight because I think that the case for apostolic succession that many Catholics seem to make is a very overstated case. Let's jump into it. The main claim that I would like to push back on is as follows.
Even though we don't have, to my knowledge, a list going all the way back to the apostles for every single bishop, it is morally certain that that we do have lines that go all the way back to the apostles.
Jimmy did say moral certainty instead of regular certainty, but for the sake of this video, I think that moral certainty and plain old certainty can be considered the same. According to the Catholic Dictionary, moral certainty is confident assent concerning human conduct based on people's normal and predictable responses to certain needs, abilities, and motivations. If you ask me, that's close enough to regular old certainty that we can read this as just regular old certainty. So Jimmy said that it is certain that we do have lines that go all the way back to the apostles. Now, Jimmy didn't exactly say that all lines go back to the apostles. He only said that we have lines that go back to the apostles. That means that I may not actually disagree with a certain interpretation of what Jimmy was saying, but it seems clear to me that Jimmy is saying that all of the Catholic bishops can have lines drawn all the way back to an apostle. That is the standard Catholic claim, and that is what I would like to push back against. But before I get into my pushback, I would actually like to highlight a few points that Jimmy makes. Around the 40-second mark into that same video, Jimmy admits that we do not actually have any such list.
To my knowledge, there is not a single comprehensive list mapping all of the world's bishops all the way back to the apostles.
And around the 1 minute mark, Jimmy admits that the lists that we do have only go back a couple hundred years.
But there is a registry within the Catholic Church that traces the lineage of all current bishops back several hundred years.
Perhaps this is why Jimmy said moral certainty instead of plain old certainty. Maybe the confident assent it has to do with like church teaching or something. Doesn't really matter. I'm going to be treating the rest of this video as if Jimmy did just say regular old certainty. What I would like to say here, though, is that we actually have good reason to be skeptical about the claims that the church makes about apostolic succession. And this is because I think that the earliest sources that we have about apostolic succession kind of contradict this later claim about having lines directly back to the apostles. We will look at two sources, both from the late 1st century. First up, we have the Didache. The Didache being a Greek word just meaning teaching, is a late 1st century text written as an instruction manual for Christians. It is an invaluable source for historians trying to learn about very early Christianity. And in teaching 15.1, we read the following. Elect, therefore, for yourselves bishops and deacons worthy of the Lord, men who are meek and not covetous, and true and approved, for they perform for you the service of prophets and teachers. Notice that this does not say elect them, but then don't let them actually perform any tasks of being a bishop. Don't let them celebrate the Eucharist like we just instructed you to do six teachings earlier. No. Elect them and then hold them aside, because we're going to send somebody, either an apostle or someone who is ordained by an apostle, or someone who is ordained by an apostle, somebody in that line. We're going to send that person to your city so that they can ratify the vote. No, none of that happened. The election seems sufficient for any person to become a bishop. No apostolic succession required, not per the Didache. And the fact that there needs to be an election at all seems to me to mean that there was not already a bishop in that city, in this new city. As in, if there were already a bishop, that bishop probably would have elected a successor. But since the Didache, which by the way was written in like the year 90, is instructing people to appoint or elect bishops, it seems to me like the Didache is talking to unincorporated Christians, as it were. Christians who have heard the good news, right? The good news has reached their city, but they don't have a bishop in their city yet. And if they're just electing people, then it seems like apostolic succession just wasn't needed. And for one other first century source, we can look at Clement's letter to the Romans. This is 1 Clement 44, written around 96 AD. Our apostles appointed those ministers already mentioned. So talk about our apostles have appointed both presbyters and bishops, and afterwards gave instructions that when these should fall asleep, other approved men should succeed them in their ministry. We are of the opinion, therefore, that those appointed by them, so the bishops appointed by the by the actual apostles, or afterwards by other eminent men with the consent of the whole church, and who have blamelessly served the flock of Christ in a humble and peaceful, disinterested spirit, they should not be justly dismissed from the ministry. So Clement seems to be acknowledging that there's kind of like two different kinds of bishops, right? Like there's those who are appointed by the apostles, but then there are also those who, at a later time, were appointed by eminent men with the consent of the whole church. This kind of seems to be like what the Didache was saying, that the consent of the whole church is kind of, that's sufficient to make somebody a bishop. And Clement seems to go even further and says that we shouldn't be dismissing anybody from the ministry as long as they've blamelessly served their flock, whether or not they were appointed by an apostle or by the consent of the whole church. Clement seems to be admitting that the consent of the whole church is enough, exactly like what the Didache says. Again, no apostolic succession required. Both of these sources that I quoted today were presented about a week ago by Dr. Steven Nemes on the channel What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. That stream is linked in the description down below. And I do urge my Catholic listeners to listen to that whole stream. I think it'll be challenging in a good way, right? But for the sake of my video, I'm only going to play one short clip from it.
But the question is, given the actual evidence that we have, what makes the best sense? And I think what makes the best sense is the idea that apostolic succession was a myth invented in the 2nd century. It evolved, it grew bigger and bigger and bigger over time, but it has no basis in the facts.
And if a Catholic wants to argue something along the lines of, well, we can't prove that it didn't happen, that, bishops were sent to go ratify all the elections that occurred for all the bishops who were elected without the laying of hands of people with a direct, I mean, that's just like a huge argument from silence, I guess. I'm not sure. Regardless, there is one more claim that Jimmy makes in the video that I would like to address.
The process has fail-safes built into it. So it's not just one bishop lays hands on you if you're going to be consecrated a bishop. It's typically at least 3. So even if there was a danger that one bishop might have been invalidly ordained, the other 2 bishops putting hands on you will secure your ordination as a bishop.
First thing I would like to say is, why are we so concerned about bishops not actually having an apostolic succession, that we have to have 3 bishops ordaining 1 bishop? I thought that there would have been clear records of apostolic succession at this time being only 200 years removed from the apostles. This seems to be a ceding of ground and admitting that it was at least a serious enough problem, this like threat of bishops not actually having apostolic succession in the 3rd century, that we needed multiple bishops to appoint one bishop just to kind of cover all of our bases. Like we need to triple up so that certainly at least one of the ordinations is going to take. And again, I mentioned 200 years. I mentioned the 3rd century, even though Jimmy himself didn't mention anything about that, because I think that Jimmy's getting this multiple bishop thing from Hippolytus writing in the 3rd century. I will refer you to the 44-minute mark in Dr. Nemes's video on What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You for more about Hippolytus and the 3rd century. But the long and the short of it is that the 3rd century is long after the Didache and Clement. Hippolytus would have been writing probably around 220-ish. And the Didache and Clement were written probably in the 90s. I mean, that's a long time. That's, the great or maybe great grandchildren of the Christians living at the time of the Didache. Those were the ones who were living at the time that Hippolytus was writing. So that seems to me to be plenty of time for legends about apostolic succession to have grown. It seems to me like the late 2nd and then the early 3rd century actually saw the need for this kind of authority-giving status, apostolic succession. In the 90s, I don't think there were very many different Christian sects all kind of vying to win the orthodoxy war. Also, in the 90s, Jesus is coming back again soon, so who really cares? The bishops are temporary roles, right? Maybe if a bishop dies tomorrow, then it's important to have a successor, but I don't think having these direct lines was at the top of their minds if they all thought that Jesus was coming back very soon. Fast forward, and now your great-grandkids are Christian. Maybe Jesus isn't coming back that soon. Maybe now there are various Christian sects, and we need to prove that ours is the real one. So we kind of invent apostolic succession. But like Dr. Nemes said, apostolic succession is simply not grounded in fact. It evolved. It grew bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And history is written by the winners. The Catholic Church is the result of the sects who won the orthodoxy wars of the 1st centuries in the years of our Lord. And so the Catholic Church claims apostolic succession. But I think that the average Catholic should be far less certain about these claims that the church makes, because the data simply doesn't back them up on this one. It only takes one bishop who is elected, like the Didache instructs bishops to be elected, in order for there to be countless modern-day bishops who do not have apostolic succession. Thanks for listening.